Lulun at the Frontier, number 2. The forest is dark. Grass rustles in the breeze. The general, in the night, stretches his bow. The next morning they find the white feathered arrow sunk in the cleft of a stone. So we continue with the second of the 4 poems included in this anthology by Lulun about frontier topics. Now, most of these poems are pretty conventional. They reference a past of military campaigns in a very diffuse and specific sort of way, and characteristics of the life of the troops and the generals at the frontiers that probably wouldn't have changed much during the, let's say, 500, 600 years that mediate between, let's say, that's a bit more. The Western Han Dynasty, for example, which lasted from 200 BC to about the beginning of the Christian era, and the Tang Dynasty. So Lulun's time would have been the 8th century. So yeah, that's about 1,000 years actually. So in 1,000 years, and you could probably go a little bit further back and a little bit further forward, more back than forward, the type of campaigning, the type of life in the frontiers, the type of frontier didn't change that much. That is, the area at which Chinese civilization stopped was much, much smaller than the current border of the People's Republic. And it was basically an ecological border as well. That is, the region where the lands that allow for a permanent agriculture start to recede into the Asian steppe, which has big grasslands and extreme temperatures, and which is a region where only nomads really can prosper. Now, since at least the Zhou dynasty, if not earlier, and continuing all through to the almost the end of the imperial period, at least until the Qing dynasty, which is the last one, China's agricultural and civil empire was continually threatened by periodic barbarians that attacked the frontiers and sometimes got further on. The most important of these during the Han Dynasty were the Xiongnu. We don't really know what tribe or ethnic group they might have belonged to. Probably Turkic peoples from Central Asia. Some have associated them with the Huns. Their leader was the Chanyu, and following a model that the Byzantines would also follow, later Chinese poets and historians continued naming the barbarians of their present with the names that had been employed in the classical histories of the past. That recycling also affects stories, so all of this detour was basically to explain that what is being told in this poem is actually an anecdote from 1,000 years before Lulun's time. So that's a story that is recounted in the Han histories about the Han general Li Guang. So the story says that this general, hunting at night, once thought he saw a tiger when the wind parted the grass. He shot an arrow at it, and in the morning he found his arrow sunk deep into stone. So such strength, such prowess that one is able to stick an arrow into the stone. Yet he wasn't able to repeat this prowess because, angry that it hadn't been a tiger, he shot at the stone again in the morning. This time his futile arrow bounced off. So the story that is meant to be so more than the story, the message that is meant to be transmitted by the story, perhaps, is not only Li Guang's incredible strength and his feats of ability. He was also a pretty successful general at the frontiers. But the fact that, when you are inspired by maybe terror or passion, you can achieve things that, when you're not inspired by those feelings, are not successful. So with that story, we've given away the topic of this poem. So this poem basically glosses the anecdote that we've just mentioned. I'm not aware how much the original readers would have perceived that until the last line, because it's in the last line when the reference to the arrow sunk in the cleft of stone that immediately the recollection for any cultured Chinese of the period would have struck into his mind. This is General Li Guang's anecdote. So even though the previous poem that we read yesterday and probably the next ones probably refer or are meant to refer to contemporary events, this one at least very clearly connects with an anecdote of the past. Even though, as I said, there probably would not have been that many changes in the type of military campaigns, in the weapons, in the clothes, in the horses, in everything from the military campaigns at the frontiers, from the hand to the town. So the topic is frontier life. Again, like in the first poem, there is this glorification of the general, who is depicted here not in his oratorical or rhetorical capacities or in his impressive looks, but but as the doer of an impressive deed, which is shooting an arrow and sticking it into a rock. And not much else to say. The poem is pretty straightforward as well. Let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet. The forest is dark, grass rustles in the breeze. The general in the night stretches his bow. Now this is a quatrain, so an intense economy of words and images and story has to be, really crammed down into, this is a 5-word quatrain, so this is 20 words, 20 characters, which are not exactly the same as words, but, well. So the first couplet really sets the scene. It gives us the background, and in the first line it gives us the background. In the second line it gives us the protagonist, the time, and the deed. So the first line describes us, we're in a forest, and there's a visual element and an oral element. We're in a forest, and there's grass rustling. So the forest is dark. You might guess from this that it's night, or it's either the forest is really dense or it's probably late in the day, maybe night. The grass is rustling in the breeze. So we have, as I said, a visual element, darkness, forest, and an oral element, rustling grass in the wind. So the next line, the general in the night stretches his bow. So now we know it's at night. The general is stretching his bow. So now we can imagine that grass rustling as a possible animal hidden in the forest in the undergrowth, or maybe an enemy. The next morning, we continue with the second couplet. The next morning they find the white feathered arrows. Of course, the arrows, as we've seen from the previous poem, are bedecked at their back with arrows with feathers that help them to fly better, to be more aerodynamic, probably. In this case, it's a white feather, probably not a vulture feather. And then the next morning, the story jumps up to the next day. The arrow is found. Where is it? Is it embedded in the ground, in some dead animal, or in some enemy's body? No. Sunk in the cleft of a stone. And so we connect with Li Guang's anecdotes, and at the same time we get this image of the general, like in the first poem, as sort of superhuman, incredibly powerful, really successful warrior as well as general. So interesting again. I would say the same thing I said in the previous poem to conclude. It's unusual to read, or at least unusual in my very limited experience, to read Chinese classical poets that paint this sort of epic, glorious image of war or of its participants or of its commanders. So it's not that frequent, at least not in poetry. So interesting take on an old legend as well.